Welcome, everybody, to my talk on accessible component libraries, the foundation of accessibility at scale. Here at AxCon 2024, we're excited to have you. First of all, let me introduce myself. I'm Rachel Yamtube. I am a developer advocate here at Deque. I studied computer science at the University of Michigan, where I had the opportunity to be on a project team where we built an indoor navigation app for Android for users with visual impairment. This is what kind of opened my mind and world to the concepts of digital accessibility and creating technologies that everyone can use. And through that project team, I was able to make connections with people at Deque and was able to join the team here. So I've been at Deque for about 5 years now. I started as a web development intern on our mobile team, where I was helping build the dashboard for viewing results from automated accessibility testing of mobile apps. So I got to learn about both web and mobile app accessibility at the same time, which was super cool. And then I transitioned into the product owner for DevTools Mobile, where I also kind of did some product management responsibilities and got to be on calls with our clients and learn about how large enterprises implement automated testing or implement accessibility testing as well. And then now today, in my role as developer advocate, I get to go to events like this and share all of the knowledge and things that I've learned about digital accessibility, which is super fun and exciting. Outside of my world of being an accessibility advocate, my favorite color is purple, and I'm a total cat person. So I have a couple images of me on the screen now, one of which is kind of the headshot that I use on social media, where I have mostly purple hair, but I have rainbow at the roots. So you can see some pink and green and purples, blues. And then I have another photo where my hair is entirely purple, and I have my 3 cats sitting on my lap. It's kind of difficult to get them all to look at the camera at the same time, as you can imagine. But Rosie is on the left. She's a black short hair cat. Roxy is in the middle. She's a tabby, a brown and black tabby with longer fur. And then Ruby is on the right, and she's a fully black long hair cat. And then today I have mostly teal hair with a little pop of purple here and there. But I always have purple in my hair. I switch up the colors all the time, so you'll see me with fun colors. If you also love purple and fun rainbow colors and cats, definitely reach out to me and connect. I am available. I'm on kind of a lot of the social media platforms. So on Twitter and YouTube, you can find me at ryamtube, where I've just published actually my first YouTube video of an introduction to a series on building cross-platform mobile apps accessibly. And then you can also find me on LinkedIn. So please connect with me on social media. I love to engage with everybody in the community. All right, so our agenda for today. Let me just take a quick sip of water and then I'll dig in. All right. First of all, I want to start talking about what a component library is, so we all have a shared understanding of that before we dig into how do we make them accessible. And then on the slides here, it's kind of a bit redundant, but each stage of the talk, first we'll start with building an accessible library, a component library. How do we build a component library that is accessible? Then we'll talk about how do we test that library to ensure that it stays accessible as we continue to develop on it. And lastly, we'll talk about how do developers use the accessible component library in a way that creates great end user experiences. So first of all, I'm going to start with what is a design system? And you may be thinking, Rachel, why are you talking about design systems? This is the dev track. What's going on? We're talking about component libraries. I think there's a lot of confusion between the two terminology. They're a lot of times used interchangeably, but I'm kind of going off of a blog posts that I saw from UXPin, which is a design framework software tool similar to Figma, where they've kind of come up with a great definition, I think, of a design system versus a component library. So looking at their definition of a design system, a complete set of design standards, in parentheses, style guide, and documentation accompanying a UI toolkit, including UI patterns, UX design principles, and components. So within this definition, a component library would be one piece of the design system. Other pieces include, like in the definition, a documentation or a style guide, things like that. When those are all combined together with your component library, that's what makes up a design system. So I do have an image of a puzzle piece looking like it's about to fit into 3 other puzzle pieces to show that a component library is one piece of the puzzle of a design system. So then what exactly is a component library? How do we define that? Again, from UX Pin, a component library is a set of pre-made, tested, and well-documented UI components that can be easily reused across the user interface of a product. So as you can see, they do mention well-documented, which I said is part of what goes into having a design system, is the documentation for your component library. However, they make the distinction that developers can use component libraries however they choose. Whereas with a true design system, they don't actually allow developers to customize it without going through usually some sort of approval process. So a lot of times organizations will have a design system team or a component library team, and those design system teams are responsible for approving and reviewing any changes that happen with the design system. So kind of with this definition, we can think of a component library as the parts and the pieces, but the design system needs to be there with the guide rails in place so that developers are using the component library in an effective way. So now that we understand kind of the difference between a design component or design system and a component library and how the two fit together, let's talk about the benefits of component libraries and why we want to use them. The first and probably easiest to think of is that it's going to reduce duplicate code. So anytime that you either have like a large application or maybe multiple applications that are in a suite together, if you're going to be using the same component in multiple places, if you don't have a shared component library, you're going to be duplicating that code in multiple places. And obviously less code is less to maintain and easier to manage. Secondly, it helps us provide consistent user experiences across large apps or a suite of apps. So as I mentioned, when we have those components that are reused in multiple places, we want that experience to be exactly identical for our users. And if we are implementing those differently in 2 spots, we run the risk of the user experiencing differences in that design pattern and in that experience and workflow. And then thirdly, it'll enable our developers to build faster. So me as a developer myself, if I'm working on a project and I'm supposed to be starting from scratch and I have nothing to build off of, that's going to take me a lot longer to build a page or build a website than it would if I have building blocks and pieces that I can just put together and pull in and use in the ways that I want to and need to. And lastly, I would say, and maybe most importantly, component libraries allow us to solve complex problems in one place, which I think is exactly where accessibility can thrive. I'll share a little quick story about back before COVID. I had the opportunity to go on site with one of our clients and my team lead at the time. And it was a large enterprise client who had massive mobile app, massive websites. We were kind of focused on the mobile app side of things. And my team lead at the time was able to connect with one of the developers on their component library and find a 1-line change in code that fixed hundreds of issues across their mobile apps. So this is really where we see the benefits and reap the benefits of a component library is when we fix one bug that's occurring in hundreds of places with one little fix in one place. And so I have a graphic on this slide to kind of represent how component libraries are a win-win for everyone. It's a win for our users, our end users. It's a win for developers. It makes their jobs easier. And it's a win for the business as well. All right, so given all of these benefits that I just listed about component libraries, it was kind of an easy choice for Deque to decide that we want to start using a component library. However, it is a big decision when you are looking at using a component library versus building your own and what the cost and risk benefits are there. So at Deque, we did decide to build our own because we wanted to make sure that all of the components were to the highest standard of accessibility. So with that, we created what we call Cauldron React. And I have a screenshot from the documentation site of Cauldron here. So I'll actually just read that out because it does a great job of introducing the framework and why we built it and what we want it to do. So the purpose of our component library, Cauldron React. First off, we start with our little tagline, friends don't let friends ship inaccessible code. Cauldron is designed with accessibility in mind, including styles covering everything from typography to colors and React components that are designed to be inclusive of all users. Additionally, Cauldron's React components are designed to include full screen reader and keyboard navigation support. The design and interactions shown throughout this site are intended to show how Deque provides accessible experiences for the users of our own products through the use of common accessible components like these. So as mentioned there, this is the component library that we use to build Deque products and build the Axe tool suite. So mostly it is an internally used library, but it is available open source on GitHub. So it's something that we maintain mostly ourselves. There's not a whole lot of outside contributions, but it is something that we build in the public because we think it's important to share and give people access to easy tools that they can use to build accessible code. And I believe we'll send the links in the chat as well for the documentation site for Cauldron as well as the GitHub repo. All right, so now that we all have a shared understanding of design systems and component libraries and the benefits, and I've introduced Cauldron React, Deque's component library, I'm going to talk about how we built the library and what our guiding principles are there so that you all can take that and use that in your own day-to-day. Before I talk about the logistics of building an accessible component library, I want to take a quote from a wonderful article on the IAAP the article's from 2019, and it's titled Accessibility by Default. So what if authoring tools could provide accessibility by default? If the built-in features didn't permit the creation of non-accessible code, this would increase the level of accessibility even before anyone started using the website. And this is from Susanna Lauren, the Global Leadership Council Vice Chair for the IAAP. I think this is a really optimistic way to think about accessibility and the future that we're heading towards. I don't think we're quite there today, but we're on the path to getting there. It would be wonderful if the platforms and everything was created in a way that developers just simply couldn't create inaccessible code, right? So I do have a little graphic of a crystal ball kind of forecasting the future where we'll someday in the future live in a world where everything is accessible by default. But for today, we use this concept as a guiding principle for Cauldron React. And the way that we do that is we try to avoid component configurations that would cause inaccessible code. Another thing that we do is handle things for the user or for the developer that may be more tricky if they don't have a lot of developer or accessibility experience. So one of those things is automatically generating IDs, which are required for ARIA relationships. Lastly, we also have default styles that have sufficient color contrast, target size, and focus appearance as well. And then I have a graphic of the accessibility icon kind of representing that we're using this principle of building a component library to be accessible by default. All right. The first thing I want to dig into is how are we automatically generating IDs for ARIA relationships? And before we actually dig into this code here, I'm going to take us out to an example. So I'm going to leave the slides for a second now and head over to the documentation site for Cauldron. So what I have here is our Cauldron page open to our tooltip example, where we have 4 buttons that are in order from left to right. One button is labeled top, the next is bottom, then left, and then right. And each of them, when we hover over them or when we navigate to them with the keyboard and they receive focus, pops up a tooltip that is to the direction that is described by the button itself. So let me head back over to our top button for an example. Looking at this button, I'm going to use the Chrome DevTools kind of picker tool to find what element the button is in the DOM. I have Chrome DevTools open to the right of my screen, and I can see that this button is, it's a button type button with the text top in the button itself. So it's a wonderfully marked up button. And then we have a aria described by equals tooltip 13. And then what I can do is when I have keyboard focus on that button, I can actually scroll down in the DOM to find tooltip 13. And there it is, which is the tooltip that's associated with the top button. One thing I want to note here is that we're using aria described by. And the reason for this is that the button already has a label because it has text in it. It has the word text. That's the label for the button. The tooltip is actually just providing extra context. So the tooltip isn't labeling the button, it's describing the button, which is why we're using the aria described by property here. But we do have another example of buttons on this site that use tooltips in a way that actually use the aria labeled by property instead. So all of our code snippets have this button here that will allow you to copy the code snippet to your clipboard. And so when I'm going to navigate to it with the keyboard, oops, sorry. And we can see the button does not have any text within it. So it is a icon that looks like you are copying items, but there's no text in the button itself. And then the text is actually provided in the tooltip, which reads copy code example to clipboard, comma, 1 of 3. So let me find that element in our DOM and take a deeper look at it. So it is indeed a button. And then the icon is coming through as an SVG. So an SVG component or an SVG element doesn't have an alt attribute in this case. So that means that there's no text and there's no alternative text for the icon that would be labeling the button. So in this case, what we've done is two things. One, we added an aria label, which is the same thing as the text in the tooltip, but we also added the aria labeled by tooltip 17, which again, I can go down into the DOM and find tooltip 17, which we can see just due to the way that this site is set up, some tooltips remain in the DOM and have a class that hides them, whereas some dynamically are removed and added to the DOM. So in this case, we can see that the tooltip is hidden, but if I hover over the button again, the class changes and it's no longer hidden and the tooltip is visible. And both of those implementations are completely accessible as well. So I just wanted to point out that the reasoning for this is that since the button itself doesn't have a label, our tooltip is what's labeling it, which is why we want to use the aria labeled by property in this case. All right, now I'm going to head back over to my slides and we'll dig into the code and how we actually implement that and allow our users to choose between aria labeled by or aria described by. So in this case, as I've explained with our examples, there's two reasonable aria attributes that can be used on the target element of our tooltip. So the target would be the element that triggers the tooltip. And so the way that we allow because there's two reasonable options, we want to give our developers that are using the component library the option to use either of those. But we do want to default to one of them, so that way we know that at least there is one aria property available. So what I have here is two code snippets, one on the left, which is our type interface. And I've excluded most of the other properties and just focusing on the one related to aria right now. So we have a property called association with a question mark, meaning that it's optional. And then we have a string aria labeled by, or the pipe indicating the or, aria described by. So this means that when developers are implementing the tooltip component in their applications, in their code, they're able to provide an association of either the aria labeled by property or the aria described by attribute. And then the next code snippet I have is our function for the tooltip component, the functional component definition, where I've also excluded the other properties, but we can see that the association property is passed in with a equals aria described by string, meaning that if the developer doesn't provide a value for the association property, we will default it to aria described by. And the reasoning for that is we likely suspect that that's the most common use case. So typically tooltips are used to add extra context as opposed to labeling the target element itself. All right, next I want to talk about how we actually set that ARIA attribute on the component, on the target element, and make sure it's associated with the proper tooltip ID. And the way that we're handling that is with a useEffect hook, where we get the attribute, we get the association attribute from the target element. So whether that's ARIA described by or ARIA labeled by, we get one of those. And then we look at the value that's returned and check to see if it includes the ID of the tooltip. And if it does not, we'll set the ID of the tooltip at that point. So what this means is that as the page changes, as things update and elements move around, things like that, if our target element changes or our ID changes, this hook will be called and will properly associate the tooltip with the target element. All right, now that I've kind of showed you some examples and principles of how we want to build the component library to be accessible by default, I want to talk about how do we test that library once we've created it. As we continue to change it and evolve it and add more components, how do we continue to test it and make sure it remains accessible by default? So our first line of defense would be unit testing. We want to test each component individually for accessibility because a component library is the building blocks of your product. And if those individual building blocks are not accessible, you can't reasonably expect the entire product to be accessible. So the way that we do this for Cauldron React is using a combination of Jest and Enzyme, but we're actually migrating to React testing library. So that is in the works currently. And then we use JestAx, which is actually an open source package that's not maintained by Deque. It's one of our outside contributors, which is awesome. But we use that for accessibility testing in our unit tests. So I have a code snippet here that is a test which is named should return no axe violations. And then an async function definition where the first thing we do is render our Cauldron component. And then the second thing we do is, in this case, we're using React testing library. So we use screen.getByRole button, but you would provide whatever role it is that the component you are testing is, which is actually a cool reason to use React testing component library because it does help you think about those roles of your components a little bit more in your testing process if you're using that method. But then lastly, what we do is we expect, we wait for the component to get tested by Axe and we expect it to not have any issues in it. And if it does detect any issues, that test would fail. Next, we have end-to-end testing because even though we tested our components individually in their own silos, it's really important to test these components together in context because that, like I said, these building blocks are going to be pieced together in context. So you also want to test them in those scenarios. And it's also a great way to do this is using a documentation site for your component library, similar to what we do with Cauldron. And that's how we do our end-to-end testing is we use Axe Core Puppeteer, which is an open source library maintained by Deque. And we use that to navigate, we use Puppeteer to navigate through our entire documentation site. And at each step of the way, we run a scan with Axe. So I have a screenshot, or sorry, a code snippet here again, where we're initializing Axe Puppeteer. We're setting specific tags, so that defines which rule sets that we're testing for. In this scenario, we're testing for all of WCAG 2, all the versions, level A and double A. So we've got WCAG 2 and 2.1, 2.2, level A and double A. And then our last line of code, we run the axe.analyze command and we wait for our results to be returned. And then same thing, you can either fail your test at this point or report on it. There's a lot of different options. And this is something you can do for free with Axe Core, but we also have more advanced testing available with our Axe DevTools APIs as well. And if unit testing and end-to-end testing isn't something that you manageably or reasonably have developer power to do, other options would be semi-automated testing and manual testing. So you can use the Axe browser, the Axe DevTools browser extension to detect issues in your component library. You could use this on your documentation site as well. So I have a screenshot here of the Axe DevTools browser extension where we have a couple different options where we could scan all of the page or scan part of the page. And then we have a list of start intelligent guided tests. So those tests will help walk you through and be able to detect some accessibility issues that can't be detected purely automated. But they can be tested for with some input from a human that understands how the app works. They don't need to necessarily have accessibility knowledge. They just need to have understanding of how your component library works. And then lastly, we want to periodically do a full manual accessibility audit. While automated testing is wonderful and can help you really maintain your agile development processes, it is still important to do a periodic manual test because there are certain things that automation simply cannot catch, even with the manual or even with the semi-automated tests. So it is important to do those periodically to make sure that you're getting that human touch in there and finding any issues that you may have missed with automation. All right, lastly, I want to talk about using an accessible component library. So now that we've talked about, we've built our component library, we made sure it's accessible by default, we have a bunch of tests in place to make sure that it remains accessible, and now we're going to give it to our developers and see how they use it to build hopefully accessible experiences for our users, right? Unfortunately, developers can still make mistakes. So accessible by default isn't a 100% guarantee. There's just some things that you can't fully prevent your developers from doing. And flexibility is important, but it leaves room for error. So in the example I talked about with our tooltip, we give users the flexibility of deciding if they want to use ARIA labeled by or ARIA described by. But that flexibility also means they have to know the difference between those two things and which one they want to use. So even though we've put in all of this effort to make a super accessible component library and test it, we even still can have developers that are using it in a way that results in inaccessible experiences. However, DevTools Linter can help. So I'll show you a demo of that right now. So I'm exiting my slides and I will head over to VS Code where I have, it's very purple because I love purple. My apologies if the color contrast doesn't work for you. Please let me know for future presentations. I can change it. But what I have is our accessibility linter plugin or extension for VS Code, which is available for free on the VS Code marketplace. And we will put a link. Actually, that was another thing I think we wanted to put a link in the chat for, but we may not have. So maybe your moderator, Yaya, can grab that for us, but I didn't prep that for them ahead of time. But this is a free extension for VS Code, so I highly recommend downloading it. And what it does is it enables, as I'm typing in my editor, it'll give me warnings and errors if I'm creating code that's inaccessible. So for example, I'm going to head over to a settings component. And we can see I'm importing a few components from Cauldron React, the button component, field wrap, main, radio group, and the toast. And then the file is actually, the file name is highlighted in red, indicating that I have some sort of error somewhere going on. So I'll scroll down and see what that is. All right, I've got some squiggly lines here on line 59 on my button component. So let me hover there and see what the issue is. So Linter is telling me I need to ensure that buttons have discernible text. All right, so let me look at my button here. And one thing to note, this is a capital B button, meaning that this is a component from Cauldron. So we do have custom component support, which I'll talk about a little bit more in a second. But let's walk through this example first. All right, so I'm looking for discernible text. So what is my button doing? All right, I got an image in here, and the source is something named question mark. So I can reasonably assume, okay, this is a help button, probably, right? But my image also has an accessibly error, which is ensure images have alternate text, or a role of none, or presentation. So images can be decorative or informative. And in this case, we're going to want to go with an informative image, which means we need to provide the alt text so that our button can also have discernible text. So if I go ahead and add an alt attribute and I provide the text help, then my linter warnings go away and I can save my file and be happy and commit my code up and have it reviewed and merged in. And so speaking of that, I'm actually going to head back over to the browser, and I'm going to open a page in GitHub where I can show you, in addition to, sorry, my headset just died. Give me a second here. Okay, I think my audio is all set now. But what I wanted to show you here is that in addition to our free VS Code extension, we also have Axe DevTools Linter, which is part of our Axe DevTools suite, which allows you to integrate linting into your CI/CD processes. So what I'm showing you here is a pull request where we have the Axe Linter GitHub action enabled as a check, and it'll actually provide those same feedback on accessibility issues directly in line in your PRs as well. So let's say I committed this code. I didn't have the VS Code plugin. I just committed my button with an image that didn't have an alt text. Whoever's responsible for reviewing my code could see these issues, or I might go in and see these issues and be like, oh, wait, actually, that's not accessible code. We can't merge that. Let me go back and fix it. So those are kind of two powerful use cases of our Axe Linter tool. Heading back over to our VS Code example, I do want to talk a little bit more about custom component support and how we're able to detect that issue that our button didn't have discernible text, even though this is a custom component and it's not a native HTML element. So taking a look at our Axe Linter YAML file, which is a configuration file that you add to the root of your project. It can be a really quite small file with just a few lines. And we have two kind of variants for custom component support. One is called global libraries, where you're able to add in libraries, component libraries that you're using that are popularly or widely used. So for example, in this case, we have MUI, which is the Material UI component library for React. And then we also have Cauldron React. So just adding the name of those libraries here automatically maps everything from those components to the native HTML components so that the linter can behave as intended. And then additionally, we have the global components property, which allows you to do that mapping more manually yourself. So let's say you have your own component library that you build. You can go in and provide definitions for all of your components and which HTML property, or sorry, which HTML element they map to, as well as what properties your custom properties map to as well. So looking at an example here, we have a card media component from the MUI library, which the card media component, if you're not familiar, you're able to use a few different variants. And in this case, we're going to tell Axe Linter that we're using the image variant so that it'll treat our card media component as if it is an image, an IMG image, lowercase. So it'll be looking for alt text. So if I head over to my recipe card component, we can see I'm importing a few different components from MUI, which does include the card media component. And then if I scroll down, we can see here's my card media component. And I do have alt text, so Axe Linter is very happy with me. But if I were to remove this alt text, it is able to recognize that this card media element is supposed to be an image tag, and it should have either alternate text or a role of none or presentation. And with that, I just wanted to conclude that that's kind of the power of Axe Linter with custom components. Your developers are getting feedback immediately as they're coding, so you can stop committing accessibility bugs to your products and your apps. Lastly, I'm going to head back over to the slides just to wrap up with a conclusion before we do our Q&A here. All right, so to conclude, building an accessible component library is hard. And that's why I said it's a really big decision to decide that you want to build your own component library versus using one off the shelf. But just know that the effort will pay off in the end, right? As I mentioned, with being able to fix one accessibility or being able to fix hundreds of accessibility issues with one line of code. So I want to give you tools and resources to help you build accessible component libraries or use component libraries that are accessible. So you can use Cauldron React just straight out of the box. Super easy, free, open source, wonderful. And you can restyle it at your own risk. Like I mentioned, you'll want to do your own testing for your color contrast, target size, all that good stuff if you're messing with the styles. But then you can also use Axe DevTools to quickly detect and fix accessibility issues, and then make sure that devs are using the component library effectively. So that applies whether you're using your own in-house built component library, or one that you took off the shelf, or one that maybe you took off the shelf and customized your own styles to as well. And then lastly, I want to give a shout out once more that Cauldron React is open source. So use it as a reference as you're building your component library, or like I said, customizing an existing component library. Cauldron React is a great reference to look at how to implement components to be accessible by default. Or if you're feeling frisky and you know what you're doing when it comes to developing accessible components, contribute to Cauldron React. Like I said, it's mostly been maintained by Deque and used as an internal component library that's built in the public, but we'd love to have more people using it and more people contributing as well. So with that, thank you. And I think we've got plenty of time for questions.
All right. Thank you so much, Rachel. That was a great session, and I think the attendees loved your content. They're really engaged in the chat, and there's plenty of questions, so we'll go ahead and jump right into it. So the first question I have here for you is from Robin. So Robin is asking, so question from a UX designer who specializes in the creation and maintenance of design systems and component libraries. How can someone like me make your role easier? So someone in the role of UX designer, as in what can I do in Figma or other, wireframing systems to make the transition into code more seamless from an ally standpoint?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question, because I think we talk a lot about shifting left in the development process and thinking about accessibility as early in the process as possible. So that definitely includes designers. And I see that a lot of people will kind of push and say designers need to learn more and designers need to annotate these designs with the specific code that needs to be implemented. But to me, I think it's a shared responsibility, right? So we need to meet in the middle, right? Developers need to be educated about accessibility so that they can see a design and think about what they need to do to make sure they implement it accessibly. But also designers need to be thinking about that as well. And maybe they annotate things in a way that's not super technical, but in a way, like even if they just mention like, hey, make sure you test this with a screen reader, I'm worried about this. Or hey, test this with keyboard navigation, I'm worried that it might not work properly. Even just things like that will go a long way in having our developers and designers work together to create accessible experiences.
Awesome, thank you. So our next question here is from Sandra. So Sandra is asking, so accessible component libraries are often viewed as a quote unquote magic bullet. If you use them, your application will automatically be accessible. However, and you touched upon this a little bit, Rachel, it is still possible to combine accessible components in a non-accessible way, or use a semantically incorrect component just because it matches the design. I'd love some ideas on how to prevent this, especially within the context of a large organization where it's difficult to oversee all usage of the component libraries. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you hit the nail on the head, right? A lot of people will say, hey, my component library is accessible. And if it just says it's accessible, that's good enough, right? But it's actually is not good enough. You want to do your own due diligence. And like I said, make sure you're using those testing strategies that I mentioned. As well as I do really think that our tool set is specifically tuned for implementing these things at scale. So like you mentioned, your use case where you're in a large organization where you can't personally oversee all of the teams, having something like DevTools Linter in your CI process is a great way to gatekeep kind of all of those low-hanging fruit accessibility issues.
Cool. And then speaking of testing, there was also a question about where does component testing fit into the rest of kind of usability testing, and especially if you're using, for example, a component library and they already have tests implemented potentially. What does testing strategy kind of look like?
Yeah, great question. I would say if you're using a component library that's open source and you're able to see what testing they're already doing, take a look at that and see, are they using Axe? Are they using something else to automatically find accessibility issues? And if not, write your own tests that maybe just call Axe, right? So maybe they're doing a great job of functionally testing those the components in the library that you're using, but they just are missing the gap on accessibility. And that's an easy thing that you can do, is add on an extra layer of tests in your project that adds that layer of accessibility testing. I think there was a little bit more to that. Can you maybe repeat the question?
Yeah, so I think you touched upon it, but really just kind of what is the where does component testing fit into the broader strategy for
Yeah.
accessibility?
Oh, I think you had mentioned usability testing as well, which I don't think I touched on too much in this presentation. My personal stance is that usability testing should be reserved for the end product, right? There's not a whole lot of value that you'll get from real end users testing your individual components, or maybe a few components like stacked together. You really want to save your usability testing because it is time and resource intensive. I would recommend saving that for your actual app, right? Do your automated and your manual screen reader testing on your components and your component library, and then do usability testing with real end users, maybe screen reader users, people with disabilities, with your actual product.
So thank you. So Tanner had a question about uh, the component library, so Cauldron. So before starting to write a component library from scratch, was there an evaluation step about which component libraries are already out there and how they fare in terms of accessibility? What were your results, if so? So kind of, if you could just talk a little bit about the process of deciding, let's create an internal component library.
Yeah, I would say we didn't take as much of a strategic approach. So I definitely would recommend, if today that's something that you're doing, is deciding about using a component library versus building your own, I would definitely recommend doing your research and finding out which ones actually perform when it comes to accessibility, because I think a lot of them will say they will. But Cauldron React kind of came about a bit more organically. So here at Deque, we have what we call creative time, where we allow our developers a certain amount of time each sprint to work on any projects that they think are exciting related to accessibility. And that's actually how Cauldron was born. One of our developers, and he's a product manager now, Harris, he actually created Cauldron React as a creative time project. And then that's kind of when we did all of our research, and we're like, oh, actually, there's a lot of benefits that we have to gain from using a shared component library across our products. So we didn't actually do a whole lot of outside evaluation of other ones. We were like, this is a good thing for Deque to do. And we have the skill set in-house. We have the teams and developers to build this, so let's do it.
Yeah, definitely. It makes sense. There's a lot of expertise within Deque that can contribute to that. And as you mentioned, Rachel, and for folks in the audience, Cauldron is open source. So if anyone wants to contribute their expertise, there's a lot of, folks that are very knowledgeable about accessibility here. You're welcome to do that as well.
Yeah.
But along kind of like similar train of thought, you mentioned this kind of in your last slide. Creating a component library is a big task, and probably not a decision to make lightly. Was wondering if you can talk a little bit more about some of the pros and cons of deciding to create a component library versus picking up something that already exists, that's already out there.
Yeah. I would say I did obviously mention a lot of the pros in my previous slides, but I will speak a little bit of the cons, and kind of from my experience of what I've seen in our development of Cauldron. I think it's important that you need to have a team or organization or leadership around your design system and your component library. So as I mentioned, Cauldron React kind of was born organically. And in that regard, it was kind of spread to different product teams more organically and not in a super structured way. And we saw a lot of pain points where it was more work for the teams to go and develop and create new Cauldron components than they were getting the benefit of it, right? And I think there is going to always be that trade-off when you're building a component library. You're going to have to invest the time, invest the resources, and your developers to build up that library. before you really reap the benefits of your other developers using it in the product. So I think that kind of touches on some of the negative sides of building your own. So I would recommend looking at existing libraries and seeing if they fit your needs and seeing if there's a reasonable option there that you can make minimal tweaks to before you go out and endeavor in creating your own accessible or just component library in general.
Oh, thank you. I think we have time for a couple more questions.
Yeah.
Zachary is asking, how do you approach building a new component from an accessibility standpoint? So if you were delivered a Figma file, what's the process of turning that into a working, interactive, and accessible component? Um, so yeah, and they're in particular interested in, kind of more complex components, such as like charts. We recently with Cauldron had the combo Dropbox, I believe it
Little
was called
box, yeah.
combo box, right? So yeah, how do you approach, building a new component in an accessible way?
Yeah, that's a great question. I could probably do like a whole session on building a component from scratch like that.
Yeah.
But I will share a little bit about our process at Deque and how we do that. So we actually use UXPin instead of Figma, which actually is not the reason why I was using their definitions. I just happened to find that on Google and I liked it. But we do use UXPin. And so our designers have a complete set of all of the component library components and elements in UXPin, which that's not publicly available because that's like in the works. A lot of the things are also more product centric too. But once those designs are created and exist, then we'll look at, we're maybe building a new feature in one of the products. Like maybe we're building a new feature in Axe Monitor. And so we'll look at, okay, what are the designs that we came up with for this feature in Axe Monitor? Do we have existing Cauldron components that we can use for this, or do we need to create a new one? And if we need to create a new one, our designers will make that design for that specific component. And they're obviously thinking about accessibility first in their process and everything. And then they'll consult with the owner of our Cauldron project right now, which is currently Jason Wilson. And he'll consult with them and we'll add any annotations to the design that are needed. And then we'll create the GitHub issue where we clearly document what needs to be done to implement it and implement it accessibly. So we'll look at keyboard navigation, screen reader support, colors, styles, the focus appearance, all of those great things that you want to consider when you're looking at a new component. And then once it's a GitHub issue, someone will pick it up. Someone at Deque development team will pick it up. Typically, the team that kind of necessitated the need for creating the new component is the one that implements it. And then other teams can use it from there. I hope
Awesome.
that is a good kind of summary. But yeah, that would be a great exercise, I think, to maybe a YouTube video of how do we build a component from scratch in Cauldron.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that was a great answer. And I'll just go ahead and ask one more question as we wrap up here.
Yeah.
So Nir asked, concerning design systems and component libraries, maybe broadly, not necessarily specifically in Deque, but who tends to make the decisions, around the what goes into those things? Is it usually designers? Is it usually devs? Maybe product folks? If you could talk a little bit about that.
It definitely varies from organization to organization and how they want to structure their teams. But a lot of times, design is usually the main owners of a design system and a component library. And so like I mentioned here at Deque, I would say our owners of our design system is our designers, so Bobby and Sean. And then our owner of the component library is Jason. And so I guess I don't think I really mentioned this in the talk, but I will say that Deque does have a design system that encompasses Cauldron. So Cauldron is available for free. People can use it and customize it however they want. But like I mentioned with our UX pin designs, those set the guidelines for how Deque developers will implement Cauldron. So that's kind of where how Cauldron fits into the Deque design system and who owns what in that regard. One thing I will mention is we've heard kind of a lot of maybe sometimes there's pushback from design, right? If maybe your developers are really excited about accessibility and they're like, hey, there's this color contrast issue and I really want to fix it, but it'll take me 3 months to argue with design about fixing it. And sometimes I don't know if this is necessarily the right thing to do. Just change it, right? If it's not that visibly different and it meets contrast ratios, just do it and then ask for forgiveness kind of thing. But yeah, I hope that kind of answered the question.
Yeah, definitely. So, a mix of things, oftentimes design, choosing your battles, being strategic. Uh,
Yeah. Mhm.